Hello everyone and welcome to Michael's vlog. Today's March 12th and you're watching the second episode of the 40-day fast series. So, what's the 40-day fast series? So, what we're going to do is we're going to challenge ourselves to practice 40 days of fasting instead of the usual only fasting on Fridays practice, which is what people regularly do. It's an additional challenge that you can take up if you want to challenge yourself a bit more this Easter. And I'd like to discuss two things on this video. So first of all is what the priest says when he marks your forehead with ash, and second the gospel that was on in the liturgy last March 10th. So, but before we get into that, what did we eat today? So, practicing fasting means that we're not going to eat any form of pork, beef, or chicken, and the only meat that we can consume is fish. So, for I only had two meals today, one for lunch and one for dinner. For lunch, I had pumpkin soup. There's just mainly kalabasa in the soup that I ate, and for dinner we had some fish with some salad. So does it get any easier? I think that after 7 days, yes, it gets a little bit easier every day, but the temptation doesn't exactly completely disappear. So especially when I was cooking the meat and preparing the meat earlier because I cook, it's still very savory, the smell, but I guess that's the whole point of challenging yourself. So, but remember, for everyone, food or meat isn't the only form of abstinence or fast that you can practice. There are a lot of forms of fasting that you can practice in addition to fasting the meat. Now, one of the more important examples that I'd like to talk about for the youth, would be if you constantly play games on your phone, or you're constantly playing mobile games or any computer games, or spending a lot of time with mobile devices or on social media, on YouTube. If you're playing Dota or if you're playing Mobile Legends, you're always playing Clash of Clans. If you do these kinds of practices regularly, it can also be a form of abstinence or fasting for you to abstain from playing those kinds of things and taking some extra time for yourself to reflect on your day or your relationship with God, or just really just abstain from doing that just for a little bit each day. So for everyone, how's your Lent going? So what are you doing for Lent? What additional challenge, or are you just practicing the regular kind of fasting only on Fridays? We'd really like to know what you're doing for Lent. So if you've already started, how is it going for you? I can say for myself, it's kind of going okay. In a sense, it's a bit easy so far. It's only been 7 days in. I guess we're gonna see different effects when we get a bit deeper and a bit closer to 40 days, because we're not even halfway there yet. But and if you haven't started yet, it's never too late to start. So we're still ways off. We're still a lot of weeks off from Easter. So that's what Lent is leading up to, Easter. And it's never too late to start. The Lord always wants everyone to have a better connection with Him. So other people say that I don't want to practice because I didn't get the ash on my head on Ash Wednesday, but it's never too late to practice. So if you are planning to start, what exactly do you want, or how are you going to challenge yourself this coming Easter, or this coming Lent? I apologize. So let's get into it. The two things that I like to talk about, first, again, it's talking about the mark that the priest puts on your forehead and what he says when he's doing that. So as the priest takes the ash and puts it on your forehead, what he says, "You are dust, and to dust you will return." And this is something taken directly from the book of Genesis, when God tells this to Adam and Eve, when Adam and Eve are being expelled from the Garden of Eden. So he's telling this as to Adam when he's told that he's going to be forced to work for the rest of his life instead of being in paradise there in the Garden of Eden. But before we get back into that, let's also talk about the gospel, uh, because the gospel last Sunday was taken from the book of Luke, chapter 4. And if you're not familiar with this story, it's the story of when Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. So that's exactly why this is uh, the the gospel for the first day, the first Sunday of Lent. So it's really talking about Jesus' encounter or Jesus' own 40 days in the desert. So Jesus didn't even have the ability to, like us, where we can eat food, but uh, we just abstain from eating pork, beef, and chicken. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert, completely hungry, so without food, and I'm not even sure, but maybe without water either. So, in this chapter, the Satan tries to tempt Jesus 3 times, and Jesus gives 3 responses, which I'd like to talk about. So the first attempt is Satan understands that Jesus' mortal body is very tired and weary because he's very hungry. So he says, "Well, if you're God, you should be able to turn this rock into stone." And this is appealing to Jesus' humanity because his body is tired. But Jesus tells him that thou shalt not live by the bread alone, but by every word of God. So Jesus' response is formulated in the way that, well, I don't really need to eat only, but I also need to do God's will. So it's talking about the perseverance in your attempt to do God's will. The second attempt is when Satan tempts Jesus with the kingdoms of the world. So Satan asked Jesus to bend his knee and worship him, and Satan can uh, give him the entire world, or as Satan says he can, which he probably can't. Um, and Jesus' response to this is, "Thou shalt only worship God, and only God should you serve." So that's just a paraphrasing there on my part, but basically this is a callback to Genesis again, when Jesus is calling back to one of the 10 Commandments presented by Moses, that you shouldn't worship any other idols, you shouldn't worship any other being, you shouldn't worship the sun or the trees, but you should worship the one true God, the creator of everything. He's the Almighty Creator. So this is a callback to Genesis, when Moses introduced those laws, the 10 Commandments, to the Israelites. So the next temptation is when Satan tempts Jesus to throw himself off the temple, because God's angels will come for Jesus if Jesus throws himself off. And Jesus' response is, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." And uh, I think this is something that's ultimately a bit relevant in today's society, because a lot of people can casually say that, well, Jesus and God are all forgiving, so I can just have my fair bit of fun in my youth, and then God will accept me later in life, when I'm older, when I'm wiser. But the fact of the matter is, when you do this knowingly, uh, it's also a form of trying to test God in a way. So we can get into that more a bit later. So I'd like to stress more about what exactly is happening here. So one of Jesus' response is taken directly from the 10 Commandments, but the other two exactly taken from the 10 Commandments. But let's go back to the story of the Ten Commandments. So after Moses presented the Ten Commandments to the Israelites, what happened was they did follow it for some time, but then as as time went on, some of the people decided to stop following the Ten Commandments. And then as the generation passed, in the next book, in the book of Deuteronomy, the next generation of Israel is called up to the challenge of living up to what the previous generation of Israelites didn't do. So this is also the origin of this, because the Israelites spent 40 years wandering around the desert in search of the Holy Land, which is something that they did, but they kind of failed in doing because on their journey, they were constantly complaining about if God really wanted to show them that land, why must they suffer on their journey? And that's why God, being all powerful and merciful, gave them manna as they were on their journey. But eventually, a lot of the sins transpired, and one thing led to another, and the first generation of Israelites didn't live up to the kingdom that God wanted them to be. Then in Deuteronomy, Moses calls on the next generation of Israelites to actually live up to that commandment which their ancestors could not. But long story short, uh, they also don't live up to those expectations. And a few generations down the line, here we are at Jesus. When Jesus is the one to take on this 40 day journey instead of 40 years, instead of how everyone before him has failed on this journey, Jesus is the one that succeeds. So Jesus uses his mix of both holiness and mortality to show everyone as an example that it's completely possible to overcome the temptations. So I'd like to relate this also to, again, let's relate it back to the what the priest says when he puts the ash on your forehead. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. So all of these things taken up, and then the three responses that Jesus gives you talks about people's relationship with God. And in that relationship with God, people are called to be humble. People are called to remember their roots. So a lot of the times people are confused, and they're very egotistic, and a lot of the problems that you can see not only in the Bible but I guess in society at large is when people are too prideful. So these passages from the Bible is talking about the exact opposite of pride. It talks about people's ability to have compassion and humility, and that's what the whole point of Easter is. So that's all the time we have for tonight, and thank you for listening. I'd like also to thank a lot of the things that I learned tonight. I learned over at the Bible Project. You can look it up at thebibleproject.com. I'm not exactly sure, but you can watch their YouTube channel at The Bible Project. Just search it on YouTube, and you can learn a lot about the history of the Bible and how you can take a whole Bible journey with you throughout the entire year. Thank you.